Mysteries of Halloween.
Halloween can be a fun and exciting time, especially for kids waiting on the tons of candy they hope to get as they venture out dressed in their costumes. Some see Halloween as a time of evil, and that celebrating it can invite the devil in. For these next few people, this calendar date sealed their fate, but neither point of view would save them. Here are 10 unsolved mysteries that happened on Halloween. Enjoy. Sometime during the early morning Halloween hours of 1981, a Manhattan couple named Ronald Sisman and Elizabeth Platzman were murdered in their apartment, which was located near Greenwich Village. The couple was severely beaten before being shot in the head, execution style, and the apartment was completely ransacked. Sisman was rumored to be involved in drugs, so authorities initially believed that to be the motive for the killings. However, the case took a bizarre turn when a prison informant claimed that one of his fellow inmates had somehow predicted the crimes weeks before it actually happened. That inmate turned out to be none other than the notorious Son of Sam killer, David Berkowitz. In 1977, Berkowitz was convicted of a series of shootings which took the lives of 6 victims and left 7 others wounded. There has always been speculation that Berkowitz was involved with a satanic cult and did not commit all of the Son of Sam murders on his own. According to the informant, Berkowitz had told him that his cult was planning to enter a residence near Greenwich Village on Halloween. They would perform a ritual murder by shooting a couple in the head before ransacking the place to remove incriminating evidence. When questioned about this, Berkowitz claimed that Sisman possessed snuff footage of one of the Son of Sam shootings and was planning to hand it over to the authorities to avoid drug charges. While no evidence was found to support Berkowitz's claims, he did provide an eerily accurate description of Sisman's apartment. No one knows if the murders of Sisman and Platzman had anything to do with the Son of Sam case, but they are still unsolved. Young Jung-song, also known as Cindy, was a 21-year-old South Korean student attending Pennsylvania State University. In 2001, she dressed up in a bunny costume and attended a Halloween party at a nightclub in State College. After leaving the club, Cindy spent the next few hours hanging out with her friends before she was dropped off at her apartment at 4 a.m. This was the last time anyone ever saw her. After Cindy was reported missing, a search was conducted of her apartment. There was no sign of a struggle, but many of her belongings, including false eyelashes from her costume, were there, indicating that she had gone inside after being dropped off. But what happened to her afterward? Shortly thereafter, a witness reported seeing a woman resembling Cindy in a Chinatown district of Philadelphia. This woman was inside a vehicle with an unidentified male and crying out for help. A bizarre lead came about in 2003 when a Luzerne County man named Hugo Marcus Selensky was arrested after the remains of 5 people were found buried in his backyard. Even though none of these remains belonged to Cindy, an informant told police that Selensky and an accomplice named Michael Jason Kurkowski Jr. had abducted her. After Cindy was raped and murdered, the 2 men allegedly buried her body at another location. Kurkowski's remains were found in Selensky's backyard, and the informant claimed Kurkowski was murdered for keeping Cindy's bunny ears as a souvenir. Thus far, no evidence was found to tie Selensky to Cindy's disappearance. But in January of 2014, the burned remains of a dozen more people were found buried on his property. It remains to be seen if any of them will be identified as Cindy Song. On Halloween night in 1977, the parents of 19-month-old Nema Louise Carter placed their child inside her crib at their Lawton, Oklahoma home. The next morning, Nema's parents were shocked to discover that she was missing. Since the window in Nema's bedroom was locked, it's theorized that her abductor had been hiding in the closet and snuck the child out of the house while her parents were sleeping in the living room. A month later, a group of kids were playing in an abandoned house 4 blocks away from the Carter home. When they opened up the house's refrigerator, they received a horrifying shock when the decomposing body of an infant came tumbling out. The child was identified as Nema Louise Carter, who died of suffocation. A similar crime had occurred in Lawton in April of 1976, when a pair of 3-year-old twin sisters, Mary and Tina Carpenter, were lured out of their home by a young woman and forcibly confined inside a refrigerator at another abandoned house. When the sisters were found 2 days later, Mary had suffocated, but Tina managed to survive. Tina identified her abductor as a local teenage babysitter named Jacqueline Robidoux. However, the child's age made her testimony unreliable, and there wasn't enough corroborating evidence to file charges at the time. Jacqueline Robidoux eventually became a babysitter for Nema Louise Carter. She was an obvious suspect after Nema's murder, but once again, there was no evidence to implicate her. Years later, Robidoux was finally charged with Mary Carpenter's murder and given a life sentence. She died in prison of liver cancer in 2005, but never admitted to the unsolved murder of Nema Louise Carter. Chaim Weiss was a 15-year-old Orthodox Jewish boy attending the Metzivah of Long Beach, a yeshiva high school in New York. The morning after Halloween in 1986, the entire school was horrified when Chaim was found murdered on his dorm room floor. He had been bludgeoned to death after a sharp blow to the skull and was repeatedly stabbed in the head, but no murder weapon could be found anywhere. Since there was no evidence of a struggle, it seemed likely that Chaim was killed in his bed while he slept before his body was moved to the floor. By all accounts, Chaim was a very well-liked boy, so no one could figure out a possible motive for the crime. There were signs that the killer was familiar with the religious customs of Orthodox Judaism. Even though it had been a chilly night, the window in Chaim's room was open, a custom which is often done to let the deceased person's spirit out. After the murder, one of the 2 school's rabbis left a memorial candle to burn in Chaim's room. 2 days later, a second candle appeared, but no one ever admitted to putting it there. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere, indicating the killer may have been familiar with the dormitory. During the night, another student on Chaim's floor remembered being momentarily awakened when the door to his room was opened before it was immediately shut again. Could the killer have initially entered the wrong room by mistake? After 28 years, authorities have never been able to find a suspect or any answers about why Chaim Weiss was murdered in such a brutal fashion. On Halloween in 1979, the unidentified body of a young woman was found in a concrete culvert near Interstate 35, just outside of Georgetown, Texas. The victim appeared to be in her 20s and had been sexually assaulted before she was strangled to death. It seemed likely she was murdered that very same day, and the only unique clue to her identity was a silver oval-shaped ring on her hand. The victim was nude, and the only garment of clothing she had on was a pair of orange socks. Since the young woman was never identified, Orange Socks became her nickname. Years later, serial killer Henry Lee Lucas confessed to the murder of Orange Socks. He even stated he had sex with her corpse after she was dead. However, Lucas did not know the woman's identity. He claimed he picked her up while hitchhiking and only remembered that her name was Joni or Judy. After being sentenced to death for the woman's murder in 1984, Lucas recanted his confession in order to have his sentence commuted. Further investigation showed that Lucas was likely working in Florida on the day of the murder. Lucas was notorious for frequently confessing to murders he never committed, and no one is sure how many people he actually killed. Henry Lee Lucas died in prison in 2001, but Orange Socks is not the only unidentified murder victim that he's been connected to. On the morning of November 1st, 1980, a truck driver discovered the nude body of a teenage girl next to Interstate 45, just outside of Huntsville in Walker County, Texas. The victim had been sexually assaulted before she was beaten and strangled to death. Since the young girl was never identified, she simply became known as Walker County Jane Doe. It's estimated that she had been murdered several hours before her discovery. An interesting backstory began to emerge when witnesses came forward to report their interactions with her on Halloween night. After being let out of a vehicle by an unidentified male at a nearby South End Gulf station, Jane Doe had reportedly asked numerous people for directions to the Ellis Unit prison, claiming she had plans to visit a friend there. However, when her photograph was circulated among the inmates at Ellis Unit, no one would admit to knowing her. Later that night, a truck stop waitress had a similar conversation with Jane Doe. The girl claimed she was 19 years old, hailed from the Arkansas Pass area, and seemed to imply that her parents did not care about her. Since this girl was killed exactly 1 year after the Orange Socks murder, and there were numerous similarities between the two crimes, Henry Lee Lucas was considered a possible suspect. However, there was never any evidence to connect Lucas to the murder, and the Walker County Jane Doe remains unidentified. In 1982, 69-year-old Marvin Brandlin lived with his wife, Ethel, in Fort Dodge, Iowa. On Halloween that year, the Brandlins were handing out candy to trick-or-treaters who came to their house. At one point, they answered the door and were surprised to see a man wearing a mask. "Trick or treat, give me your money or I'll shoot." The Brandlins thought someone was playing a Halloween prank and tried to remove the man's mask, but he wouldn't let them. Instead, the masked man entered the home and pulled out a gun. He demanded that the couple bring him down to the basement and give him all the money they had stashed in their safe. The Brandlins became suspicious, since very few people knew they even had a safe in their basement. For this reason, Marvin was still convinced that a friend or family member was simply playing a Halloween trick on them. When the masked man led the Brandlins through the kitchen toward the basement, Marvin made a grab for the gun. The intruder wound up shooting Marvin in the throat before fleeing the house and, inexplicably, leaving his mask behind. Ethel was so traumatized by her husband's death that she died only a few months later. Over the years, an acquaintance of the Brandlin family had allegedly bragged about committing the murder, so DNA testing was performed on the mask. However, there wasn't enough usable material for an adequate test, so there is still no evidence to charge this suspect, and Marvin Brandlin's murder officially remains unsolved. On the morning of October 31st, 2004, a housekeeper at the Hilton Resort and Marina in Key West, Florida, found something in the garbage bin of the ladies' room in the lobby. She may have initially assumed it was a Halloween prank, but the situation became truly horrific when she realized she had found the body of a newborn infant girl. The child still had the umbilical cord and placenta attached to her body, indicating that someone recently gave birth to this girl and decided to just toss her into the trash. It did not take authorities long to figure out who was responsible. Hours earlier, a young pregnant woman and 3 male companions were seen walking through the hotel lobby. She entered the ladies' room while the men waited outside. At one point, a female witness went into the washroom and heard the pregnant woman moaning inside a stall. When the witness asked the 3 men if they knew the woman, one of them claimed to be her boyfriend. He even called out her name at one point, which sounded like Samantha or Sonia. The pregnant woman was in the bathroom for approximately 40 minutes, and a security guard saw her clutching her stomach when she exited. When the guard asked if she was all right, he was told she had gotten sick by partying too much at a nearby fantasy fest. The 4 individuals were escorted out of the hotel, but the child was not discovered until morning. Fingerprints, blood samples, and DNA evidence were taken from the washroom and compared to several suspects, including Casey Anthony. However, the mother and the 3 men have yet to be identified, and no one has been prosecuted for the newborn's death. Chris Jenkins was a 21-year-old student from the University of Minnesota who visited a downtown Minneapolis bar on Halloween night in 2002. After leaving the bar around midnight, Chris vanished without a trace. He remained a missing person for 4 months, until his body was discovered in the Mississippi River. Since Chris was still wearing his Halloween costume, all indications were that he died shortly after he disappeared. Chris was heavily intoxicated that night, and since his cause of death was determined to be drowning, authorities initially believed it was an accident or suicide. His parents refused to believe this and pressed for a more thorough investigation. Finally, in 2006, the death was reclassified as a homicide. While the authorities have withheld specific details, they claimed that an incarcerated suspect told them he was present when Chris was murdered and thrown off a bridge into the river. Even though police believe this man's story to be credible, no charges have ever been filed. However, one possible theory is that Chris Jenkins could have been a victim to the mysterious smiley face murders. During this time period, approximately 40 male college students in the United States were victims in a bizarre series of drowning deaths. In some of these cases, unexplained smiley face graffiti was found near the body of water where the victim drowned. This had led some to the theory that these deaths were connected and that the victims were drugged before being thrown into a body of water to make their murder look like an accidental drowning. While no smiley face graffiti was ever found in connection to Chris Jenkins' death, investigators cannot overlook its similarities to many other unsolved cases. On Halloween in 1955, Marilyn Damon took her 2-year-old son Stephen and 7-month-old daughter Pamela to a supermarket in East Meadow, New York. While she went shopping, Marilyn let Stephen wait outside the store with his sister, who was inside a carriage. 10 minutes later, Marilyn exited the store and was shocked to discover that both Stephen and the carriage were gone. Shortly thereafter, the carriage was discovered about 1.5 blocks away. However, even though Pamela had been left inside the carriage, Stephen was nowhere to be found. He has not been seen since. In many cases where infants are abducted, it's theorized that the perpetrator wanted a child of their own and decided to raise the missing infant under a new name. Over the years, DNA testing has been utilized in an attempt to determine if Stephen Damon was ever given a new identity. At one point, investigators noticed that Stephen bore a resemblance to the infamous boy in the box, an unidentified child who was found murdered inside a cardboard box in Philadelphia in 1957. However, DNA testing would eventually confirm that Stephen and the boy in the box were not the same person. In 2009, a Michigan man named John Barnes came forward believing he might be Stephen, but DNA testing also ruled this out. It is possible that an adult Stephen Damon might be living another life somewhere under a different identity, unaware that he was once taken from his real family. His whereabouts continue to remain unknown. So as the days count down and Halloween approaches, keep a close eye on those around you, just in case. You never know what might happen. As it is said, the veil between our world and the spirit world is lifted at this time of year. So proceed with caution. Don't play with a Ouija board, as I always say. And the most important thing to remember, you can't forget this one. All Halloween candy is on sale on November 1st, so if nothing else, stay alive for the discounts. See you next time.